Welcome back to another mini episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers, and I'm going to be talking about something today that has popped up in a few conversations I've had through Instagram around the term toxic masculinity. I know that many men don't like the term, and I think I've talked about it on podcasts before, and this comes from this idea that so the word toxic means bad, basically, one for a better way to put it. Masculinity is collapsed into men, or all men. So this kind of sentence or phrase or, description, toxic masculinity, is interpreted by many men as all men are bad. AKA, I am bad, right? That's what men hear when they hear that phrase. So I just want to talk about that and unpack that a little bit, because I won't say, am I a big fan of the phrase? I'm not a huge fan of the phrase toxic masculinity, but the more I read about it, the more I understand, that it's accurate in its sense. It's our interpretation sometimes as men, especially, that means that we feel uncomfortable with it, right? Because if you hear a phrase that you're translating in your brain to being all men are bad or I am bad, you're going to get your back up, you're going to get defensive, you're going to want to resist this. So in this episode, I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about, healthier ways to be as a man, or, to hold the other men around you to healthier ways of being. But first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about quickly Wikipedia's description of toxic masculinity. Right, I'm just going to read this because I can't remember the whole thing. The concept of toxic masculinity is used in academia and media discussions of masculinity to refer to certain cultural norms that are associated with harm to society and men themselves. Important part there: harm to men themselves. Traditional stereotypes of men are socially dominant, along with the related traits such as misogyny, homophobia. I'm going to add in transophobia as well, which isn't there, but I think that's also quite relevant. Can be considered toxic due in part to their promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. And I'm now going to add in, sexual assault, groping, touching, even certain types of staring when it's very intense and it's at certain body parts can really feel like sexual assault and harassment. And domestic violence, these are sort of things that can be joked about in certain situations. Back to Wikipedia's description. The socialization of boys in patriarchal societies often normalizes violence, such as sayings like boys will be boys, about bullying and aggression. Now, I think there's an important part in there to say is like that it actually hurts men themselves. That it's a set of traits, right? It's very clear there. A set of traits that are embodied, such as misogyny, homophobia, bullying, aggression, those sorts of things. And it's not necessarily demonizing that, for instance, something like aggression. You can't argue that aggression is bad, but you can pretty much argue that bullying is bad most of the time. Misogyny and homophobia are, always bad. Have I been guilty of those things? Definitely in my life. Am I guilty of those things sometimes unintentionally now? Probably, yeah. And am I called out on that by people in my life? Sometimes, which is good. This is the thing, because some of this misogyny and homophobia is quite internalized, so we don't even realize when we're doing it. Maybe you see a man wearing pink, and you're like, why is this dude wearing pink? Like, why does that rile you so much? I know for a fact, some people, I remember when, maybe I'm a bit older than a lot of you, when Cameron, the rapper, he started wearing his big pink, he wore a lot of pink basically at some point. And for a black man rapper in New York in the noughties, that was a bit like, oh, he's wearing a color that was only associated with girls. Again, that is internalized homophobia, that's internalized sexism, for instance, internalized misogyny, that a color is associated to a gender, and that if someone not in that gender wears that color, what does that mean about them? When you hear phrases like he's gay, he's a puff, whatever, as a slur, it's like that's homophobia. It's unnecessary. So what I'm saying is that masculinity itself isn't the problem, right? In and of itself, masculinity is not bad. Toxic masculinity as a phrase does not mean all masculinity is toxic, right? I think one of the reasons we also get our backs up against this as men is, I think really honestly, it's because we all know we've done some shit that's bad. We've all done some misogynist shit. We've all said some homophobic stuff. So when we hear the phrase, we know internally in our body that there's somewhere that we have done bad things and we want to be defensive. You know, that's my opinion, because I see that happens for me, where I see toxic masculinity talked about and I'm a bit like, oh God, you know, I feel a contraction, I feel a tensing, I feel like wanting to be defensive and stuff. But I also have seen from people I know, friends, even family, you know, I've heard the misogyny, I've heard the homophobia, I've heard the, you know, some of the kind of rape culture jokes / comments. And, you know, when I was younger, maybe I didn't think so much of it, but now I'm a lot more attuned to hearing it, and it doesn't happen around me so much. So really, this toxic masculinity is a group of traits, a group of habits and values that are often embodied in men. Not all men, some men, lots of men, most men even, you know, to a lesser degree, which have really been grouped together and called toxic masculinity. You know, what's inside there a lot when it comes to toxic masculinity to me is a lack of love, compassion, and empathy towards oneself, others, and the world around us, right? This is a really important part, because if you are saying things that are sexist, you have no compassion for the other gender that might be affecting. Or if you are making transphobic comments, you might say, oh yeah, but there's no one trans here. But it's like someone else is hearing you, maybe a friend is hearing you, and then that influences how they think. And then maybe they mention the thing that you said and that knocks on. Or maybe you're saying it to someone, you might be saying to a friend of yours, a guy you know, these transphobic comments like, oh, why would a man want to be a woman? Like, what's wrong with them? They're confused and blah, blah, blah. And that same person you might be talking to might be having these same considerations about themselves. Like, do they want to, you know, maybe they don't feel like they were born in the right body. Maybe they're thinking about transitioning. And when you say that to them, right, you're shaming them. You're causing them to be like, shit, I can't do this because people won't accept me, right? And we all know it's like to not be accepted. And you might say, oh yeah, but that's a pretty rare scenario. But it's like, but you don't know. You really just don't know, you know? And also, it might not just be them. It might be a cousin of theirs that's come out trans, or a friend of theirs that's come out as trans. You know, it could. You know, people do struggle with their gender identity, and there's nothing wrong with that per se. So it's just having compassion and care and empathy for what other people might be struggling with. It's a lot like, you know, where we talk about racism is a lot of the time, you know, as a black man and as someone who spoke a lot around Black Lives Matter and so forth, it's like a lot of what people are asking for is compassion and empathy. It's like, can you understand my life experience and what's happened with me? Can you put yourself in my shoes? So, you know, I think a big part of the remedy to toxic masculinity is more empathy, is more understanding of other people, is more empathy towards ourselves, because there's also a part of toxic masculinity that is shaming men's expression of emotion, or calling them weak for being vulnerable, or calling them weak for crying, or mocking them for crying. And it's like, in doing that, you also shame yourself, because if you see, I don't know, a meme of a man and he's crying and you're like, fucking pussy, what's wrong with him, blah, blah, blah. There's also going to be a time in your life where you're going to want to cry. And because of how you have externally shamed, you're going to have the same judgment on yourself. So it's like when we relax some of these ideas, we actually give ourselves a bit more room to exist, a bit of room and range to be men. So this is where, you know, I think a big problem is, you know, I don't think it's the only problem. I also see this certain, you know, there's a few other ways in which in the world that this toxic masculinity kind of roams, you know, not the only things. Like I said, homophobia, it comes out in ways like that. Suppression of women, suppression of anything we see as feminine expression. You know, like I said about Cameron wearing pink, like anything like that. It's like, oh no, we shouldn't do that as men, especially, or trying to suppress it in the world in general. This might be in your partner, your wife, your girlfriend might be expressing herself very wildly or boldly, and that goes up against your masculine instinct of being stoic and still, and you try and suppress her emotion, or you tell her not to feel, or you tell her let's just stick to the facts, because That is a suppression of a feminine expression, which you could also do to a man who is expressing himself, maybe loud colors or anything that we deem as feminine, right? Also, this toxic masculinity kind of at the higher levels is this idea of like really about money. Everything's about money and power, because this toxic masculinity is actually it's immature masculinity. So if you are immature and you feel powerless, you will always be trying to gain power. And obviously money in our society is seen very much as directly to power. So this is where we see this constant wanting for power. Maybe that is from managers and bosses and CEOs. And then this power hungriness also feeds into this next part, which is like the destruction of the earth, whether that's forests, whether that's seas, whether that's lands, whether that is indigenous people, just for the sake of money, right? And you see this in our own lives where you might be pushing yourself really hard just to make more money, or you might be neglecting your family and friends just because you want to make more money, or you might even be doing work that you know is hurting the planet and detaching from that and just looking at the money. And I just want to say there's nothing wrong with money. There's nothing wrong with making money. Like there's no harm in that at all. But it's when this money is really just being made for the sake of being made, not so much for doing good in the world, or you're doing it to obtain more power just from a place of feeling powerless, maybe individually or as a collective. I talked about the problem of shaming emotions and shaming them in men. There's also this idea of competition at all costs, or winning at all costs, really it is. This idea of like, as men, we got to be winning at all costs, Who cares about what happens to the other man or the person I'm competing against? It's just this win-win-win without care, compassion for the implications of trying to do so. So, these are some of the traits that we see. And when it comes to toxic masculinity, there's also this idea of alphas, which I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but I'm going to just read an extract from a researcher. His name is Franz de Waal. He is a PhD and he is an expert in chimpanzees and chimpanzee politics, which is a book that he wrote way back, which was a lot of this idea around alpha males was taken from. And he says the following thing in a TED talk that I listened to not too long ago. Alpha male for them is a bully. I really don't like that as a description. The term alpha male became very popular, and I think it was used in a mischaracterization. It's used in a very superficial way that doesn't relate to what a real alpha male is. And this is a man who's an expert in his field of looking at primates, so looking at alpha males and how they operate in a group. And he goes on to talk about, in his TED talk, the actual traits that make a successful alpha male in a chimpanzee group. I can't remember the exact term. And he actually goes on to say that they are being generous, the giving out of food, being affectionate to the babies in the group, keeping peace within his group. The alpha male is often the most empathetic in the group. He's also the person that people go to when they need consoling, they need help, they need support. And one of the final things he goes on to say is that the alpha male often provides security for the lowest ranking members in the group. Now, if we compare that to our ideas of what an alpha male in human society often is, it's, we've associated with some loudmouth, bullying, win at all costs, don't care about anyone else apart from their own stuff type of behavior, which goes into there's a direct polarization of what this expert in chimpanzees and alpha males has gone on to say. He goes on to say, I want to leave you with this. If you're looking at men in our society who are the bosses of, say, a family, a business, Washington or whatever, you call them an alpha male, you should not insult chimpanzees by using the wrong label. You should not call a bully an alpha male. Someone who's big, strong, intimidates and insults everyone is not necessarily an alpha male. And I think this is a really important part, because we often look at someone who is big and strong, I put strong in inverted commas, and think, oh, they're alpha, I want to be more like them. And it's just simply this. To be a masculine man, I will put this aside, the term alpha, right? Because we've got that all wrong, right? We see this from the evidence there. To be a masculine man, a mature, positive, healthy masculine man, it doesn't only look one way, right? It doesn't mean you're dominant and you have control and all those things, because you could argue control is one of the biggest illusions that we hold on to as men and as human beings. But being a mature, positive, healthy man is when we bring love and compassion into our lives, into our worlds. And again, like, just want to reiterate, love, when we hear the word love, people often think of like, oh, that means just letting people walk all over me and do what they want. It's like, no, love can be a very fierce and strong and direct thing. You know, the love of a father for his son, or love of a mother for a child. You know, I'm sure all of you were on the receiving end of a good telling off in its various forms from your parents, and they did that because they loved you, because they wanted you to have the right values, have the right goals, have the right way of thinking, or the better ways, better goals, better ways of thinking. Also, a healthy, positive, masculine man brings in social and self-awareness of himself, the implications of his actions, his words, you know, all those things become important. Integrity, you know, treating other people with care and compassion, because that's what one does when one is a leader. It's like you treat people better even than they treat you. An important part for me as being a positive, healthy, masculine man is sexual discipline. Is not just, you know, being controlled by one's urges, you call that, but our biggest urge that controls us often is sexuality. Bringing wisdom into the world, you know, being not necessarily clever, but also there's a different type of knowing and intelligence that when we slow down and we have peace, that we can bring wisdom, because we can look at everything and we can make decisions based on what's there, not make decisions based on our ego, which is afraid of being powerless and being weak, which is something we see a lot in the world. And some of the things that also I see as healthy, positive, masculine traits is, you know, generosity, you know, protecting those around you, protecting those who are less fortunate than you, not bullying those who are less fortunate than you, because that is really a sign of real weakness. Healthy competition as well is like the sort of competition that doesn't just lift you up, but also lifts the person you're competing up against as well. You know, we see some of this stuff in football games when there's like a final and a team loses, and, you know, one team wins, one team loses, but the team that wins doesn't go over to the losers and scream in their face and laugh at them. The team that wins, when they see the players on the floor crying or unconsolable, they go to them and they console them. They go to them and pick them up. That is healthy competition. That's the sort of competition that isn't just good for both competitors, it's good for us to watch as well. And then the last thing I think is really important is presence. Being really present to this moment, being able to really be in one body and sit with the people we're with and be present with them, and not be caught up in our thinking constantly, strategizing of what wrong people are trying to do to us, or our fears about other people. And this is what we see that's so lacking in our world. If we look at our politicians, especially in this moment, you know, they're acting from this fear constantly of being shown up, of not being good enough, or not being capable, or not being strong. And it's when we're operating from that, we make so many terrible decisions about our lives and the world. So presence is incredibly, incredibly important. And one of the reasons why I've kind of dived into this topic so much is because I recently run a workshop around masculinity called Masculinity Redefined, which is really successful. A lot of guys really enjoyed it. And also out of that, I've created an 8-week program to help men really step into a more positive, caring, compassionate way of being men, both to themselves and other people. And it's a group coaching program, right? So I've created this as something that's a lot more accessible than my one-to-one coaching. And I also have witnessed the power of men coming together and supporting each other and, you know, sharing together. And a lot of the program will be around things like masculinity and leadership, both in our relationships, but even in one part of it's around sexual leadership, and, you know, setting goals in our lives, going after what we want, creating accountability amongst the men in the group. Also, I'm going to be talking about things like I said, about relationships, how we can be more present, how we can build more self-awareness, how can we be better men, basically, is a big part of this. So if this is of interest to you, you know, I've already got 4 or 5 men signed up. I'm going to cap things at about 12. So the group is really manageable. If you're looking for like-minded men who are in the game of being better men, being more connected men, being more open and honest and prosperous men, not just for themselves, but for the world, for themselves, then this is for you. You know, if you've been listening to my podcast a while, then this is a beautiful entry into, you know, working with me and working with other people. And if this is of interest to you, this course, it starts in June. It's going to be every Wednesday through June, and then the 3 Wednesdays in July. And yeah, you just give me a message, and if you're interested, we can have a conversation and see if it's a right sort of program for you. And like I said, I'm not going to be taking on everyone. It needs to be people who are really in the game of transformation. And I know the men that have already signed up are really in that game because I've spoken to them multiple times. So if this is something that feels good for you, feels like something you'd want, then please contact me through Instagram at @theauthenticman_, or you can contact me through email, which is hello@theauthenticman.net. And also a message to the ladies that are listening. If you've got a brother, a father, a friend who you think would benefit from this episode and my program, just let them know. You know, that's one of the most loving gifts you can give them. I've had men who've come to me for coaching, and they've been recommended to me by their wives, by their sisters, by their friends. And they're so grateful that they were recommended, you know, after we've spoken, and they've been able to really move through some of these things that are blocking them, because that's really what stops us from being more connected men, is our fear and the other things that block us. That's enough for me today. It's been good to deliver this message to you. You know, men, you're not toxic. You can do amazing and great things. And I know that the world often focuses on the bad, but this is our human condition, and the media does so because it sells more newspapers and clicks. But just know that, you know, inside you, no matter what you've done in your life, is an incredible man who's capable of incredible love, beautiful feats, strong containers and boundaries for other men, and holding each other to better. And it's just whether you choose to tune into that man or tune into the slightly more toxic man that lives in you as well, because we all have these two sides to us. You know, even me talking here, you know, I'm not a perfect man. I have these two bits of me that operate, and I do my best to reorientate myself constantly towards love and connection and sort of strong vulnerability. But like I said, enough of me today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Ciao, ciao.